Hello, I'm doing a book review, and yes, I'm back to doing book reviews now. I'm finally done with the Star Wars reviews, which honestly took a lot out of me, as much as I like Star Wars. After doing all those reviews, I'm a little burnt out on it right now, so I'm back to my usual cycle of doing book reviews, and the book I want to review is The Conqueror Worms by Brian Keene. Now, The Conqueror Worms was published in 2005 and was originally published under the title Earthworm Gods. Now, this is a post-apocalyptic giant monster novel. Now, the plot of The Conqueror Worms is essentially a superstorm happens, like, it starts raining literally all over the entire planet, and the world is becoming flooded, and within a matter of days, all of America's coastal cities are completely wiped out. And nobody can figure out if this storm is the result of climate change, or if it's literally an act of God. Like, at first, people think that this storm is the result of global warming, but it seems like this storm is defying all scientific explanation. Now, the story follows an old man named Teddy Garnett, who is living up in the mountains, but his mountain is now becoming more of an island. And he pretty much knows that it's the end of the world, and it's only a matter of time before his house gets flooded out, but he ends up meeting up with his best friend, Carl, who he's delighted to find is still alive, but Carl's house just got wiped out by what appears to be a sinkhole, and eventually him and Carl discover that giant earthworms are coming up from the ground. Now, that's the basic plotline of The Conqueror Worms, but believe me, there's a lot more to the story than just that, because at a certain point in this book, a helicopter crashes by Teddy's house. I'm not going to give away how it crashes, but you're introduced to two more characters, and one of them tells their story, and that's when the book becomes a story within the story, and at this point in the book, it almost feels like a completely different story, and let's just say that giant worms aren't the only monsters that show up in this book, and I was actually not expecting some of the directions that this story takes. Because, believe it or not, this goes outright supernatural. Like, when I first heard about this book, I thought, like, there was gonna be, like, a sci-fi explanation behind some of it. Like, okay, this storm was somehow brought about by global warming, and these giant earthworms are, like, prehistoric worms that have been existing under the ground for millions of years, and now this storm has allowed them to come up, and that is a theory that's presented at one point, but no, there's actually a supernatural explanation for what's going on in this book. Like, at first it's theorized that maybe this is the work of God, like maybe God is punishing mankind, but then there's another point where you kind of get the idea that perhaps the devil is influencing all this. But even when it gives the supernatural explanation, it doesn't fully explain it either. It kind of leaves a lot of it up to the reader's interpretation. But yeah, I really enjoyed The Conqueror Worms. Now, I know some people might get turned off by how in the middle part of the book it kind of becomes a completely different story, and I think some people might get turned off by how unapologetically weird it is, but that's something I honestly really loved about the book. And I thought the main character, Teddy, was an extremely likable character. Like, you feel so bad for this old man because you find out in the book that he does have children and grandkids, but they were living away from him when all this was happening, so you pretty much know that they're probably dead. And in the beginning of the book, there's sort of this sad, melancholy tone to it because he knows that the world is coming to an end, and he knows that he's probably gonna die very soon because of this flood that's happening. And that's why you feel so bad for him, because in the beginning of the story, you see him reminiscing on his life, and he starts to wonder, was my life really worth it if this is what it was leading to? And another thing I liked about the character of Teddy Garnett is he's a very devout Christian, and in a lot of books like this, whenever you're introduced to a religious character, usually when all this bad shit is happening, usually that character like has some kind of crisis of faith or ends up losing their faith altogether. But with the character of Teddy Garnett, it seems like losing faith in God is never an option for him, even with all this horrible stuff happening. Like, he really does come off as a true Christian, but at the same time, though, he's not preachy, and he doesn't try to force his religion down anybody's throats. Like, at a certain point in this book, you meet a character who's gay, and he doesn't even bat an eye at that, and he also meets characters who do say that they don't really believe in God, and he never tries to, like, say, oh no, you have to believe in God. He just is like, okay, that's your choice. Like, so he doesn't judge people just because they're not Christian, which is another thing I really liked about his character. I also loved Teddy's best friend Carl because he's kind of a dumbass. Okay, dumbass really isn't the right word for him, but he's definitely, like, not the sharpest tool in the shed, but he's still a very likable character. And there is a human villain in this story, a character named Earl Harper, and I don't want to give away too much about what happens with this character, but it is pretty interesting. But while there is this sad, melancholy tone to it, it's still a very fun book as well. Like, this really does feel like a B-movie in book form. Even though if they ever did make a movie off this, it would probably have to be a pretty big-budgeted film. My only real complaint about this book is throughout the novel there are references to this white fungus that is growing on everything, and at one point you find out from one of the characters that if this fungus gets on a person, it would basically eat that person alive, and Brian Keene never really does anything with this fungus, and there was a real opportunity to introduce a real cool, like, body horror element to it, but it's never really followed up on. It ends up feeling like more of a red herring. But other than that, I still really enjoyed The Conqueror Worms by Brian Keene, and I definitely recommend it if you haven't read this. So, yeah, that was my review on The Conqueror Worms, and bye.